What if I told you that one of the greatest heroes in Jesus' teachings belonged to the very group most Jews despised? Not a priest, not a rabbi, not one of his disciples. A Samaritan. That choice wasn't accidental. It was shocking. In the first century, mentioning Samaritans could instantly stir centuries of bitterness, suspicion, and resentment. To many Jews, they weren't simply foreigners. They were traitors, people who claimed to worship the God of Israel, while following what many considered a corrupted version of the faith. So why would Jesus repeatedly place Samaritans at the center of some of his most important moments? Why would he stop to speak with a Samaritan woman at Jacob's well when even his own disciples seemed surprised? Why would he make a Samaritan the hero of perhaps the most famous parable ever told? And why was the only leper who returned to thank him a Samaritan? These stories are so familiar that it's easy to miss just how controversial they really were. Because without understanding who the Samaritans were, you can't fully understand the Gospels. Most people assume Samaritans were simply people who happened to live in Samaria, but history tells a much more fascinating story. They had their own temple, their own priesthood, their own copy of the Torah. They celebrated Passover. They believed in Moses. They worshipped the God of Abraham. And here's the twist. The Samaritans didn't believe they had abandoned the true faith. They believed the Jews had. That single disagreement would grow into one of the oldest religious conflicts in biblical history. A conflict that lasted for centuries. A conflict so deep that many Jews would rather take a much longer route than walk through Samaritan territory. Imagine two families who once shared the same ancestors, the same scriptures, the same promises, and the same God. Generation after generation, distrust grows. Stories are passed down. Old wounds never heal. Eventually, children inherit a hatred they never personally experienced. That's exactly what happened between Jews and Samaritans. By the time Jesus arrived, this division had existed for nearly 700 years. It shaped politics, religion, travel, marriage, even ordinary conversations. And then Jesus did something no one expected. Instead of avoiding Samaritans, he walked straight into their towns. Instead of treating them as enemies, he spoke with them, he healed them, he praised them. Again and again, Jesus crossed boundaries that everyone else believed should never be crossed. But to understand why his actions were so revolutionary, we first need to go back hundreds of years, long before the Roman Empire, long before Herod, long before the birth of Christ, to a time when there were no Jews and no Samaritans, only one united nation called Israel. Because the story of the Samaritans doesn't begin with hatred. It begins with a kingdom. If you're passionate about discovering the historical context behind the Bible, make sure to subscribe to Bible Decoded. Every week we uncover the people, places, and forgotten history that reveal the Bible in a whole new light. And as you watch, I want you to think about one question. If the Samaritans worshipped the same God and read the same Torah, why did Jesus' audience consider them worse than pagans? The answer begins with one of the most important turning points in Israel's history. To understand who the Samaritans really were, we have to begin with a surprising fact. There was a time when Jews and Samaritans didn't exist. There was only one nation, Israel. After centuries of wandering, conquest, and settlement in the Promised Land, the 12 tribes of Israel were finally united under a single king. First came Saul, then David, and finally Solomon. Under Solomon's reign, Israel reached the height of its power. Its borders expanded farther than ever before. Trade flourished. The kingdom became wealthy. Foreign dignitaries traveled from distant lands just to witness its splendor. But above all, there was one achievement that defined Solomon's reign: the Temple in Jerusalem. For the first time in Israel's history, there was a permanent place where the people could gather to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. No longer was the Ark of the Covenant housed inside the portable tabernacle that had traveled through the wilderness. Now it rested inside a magnificent sanctuary built from cedar, gold, and enormous carved stones. The temple became the spiritual heart of the nation. Every major feast pointed toward Jerusalem: Passover, Pentecost, the Feast of Tabernacles. Everything revolved around that sacred place. From the outside, Israel appeared stronger than ever, but beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to form. As Solomon grew older, his heart slowly drifted away from complete devotion to God. The Book of Kings tells us that his many foreign marriages introduced pagan worship into the kingdom. Altars to other gods appeared alongside the worship of Yahweh. The spiritual unity that had once defined Israel began to erode. God warned that the kingdom would not remain united forever. Still, the division wouldn't happen during Solomon's lifetime. It would come after his death. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne. At first, everything seemed normal. Representatives from all 12 tribes gathered to recognize the new king. But one request changed history. The people came before Rehoboam with a simple plea. His father had placed heavy taxes and forced labor upon the nation. Would the new king lighten the burden? The older advisors urged wisdom. They told Rehoboam, "If you serve the people today, they will serve you faithfully for the rest of your life." But Rehoboam ignored their counsel. Instead, he listened to younger advisors who encouraged him to appear stronger than his father. His answer shocked the nation. He declared that if Solomon's rule had been heavy, his own would be even heavier. "My father disciplined you with whips," he essentially said. "I will discipline you with scorpions." Those words shattered the kingdom. Almost immediately, 10 tribes in the north rebelled. They rejected the house of David. Instead, they crowned a new king, Jeroboam. From that moment on, Israel became 2 separate kingdoms. To the south, the kingdom of Judah. Its capital remained Jerusalem. The temple remained there. The descendants of David continued to rule. To the north, the kingdom of Israel. Its capital would eventually become a city called Samaria. At first, this looked like little more than a political split. One kingdom had simply become 2. But politics rarely stays separate from religion. Jeroboam immediately faced a dangerous problem. 3 times every year, his people were expected to travel south to Jerusalem for the great biblical festivals. Imagine the situation. If citizens of the northern kingdom kept visiting Jerusalem year after year, would their loyalty eventually return to the king in Judah? Jeroboam feared exactly that, so he made a decision that would permanently change biblical history. Instead of allowing his people to worship in Jerusalem, he created new centers of worship within his own kingdom. Golden calves were placed at Bethel and Dan. New priests were appointed. Alternative festivals were established. It wasn't simply political independence anymore. Religious separation had begun. The 2 kingdoms still worshipped the God of Israel. They still traced their ancestry to Abraham. They still read the law of Moses. But with every passing generation, their differences grew larger. Suspicion slowly replaced trust. Shared history gave way to competing identities. Neither side realized it yet. But this division was only the beginning. Because within 2 centuries, an empire unlike anything Israel had ever faced would arrive from the east. Its armies would conquer the northern kingdom, scatter its population, and forever change the identity of the people who would one day be known as the Samaritans. For nearly 200 years, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah existed side by side. Sometimes they cooperated. Often they fought. But while both kingdoms argued with each other, a far greater threat was rising in the east, the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were unlike any enemy Israel had faced before. They weren't simply interested in collecting tribute. They wanted complete control. They conquered nations with overwhelming force, and once they captured a kingdom, they had a strategy that was both brilliant and terrifying. Instead of allowing conquered people to remain in their homeland, they deported them. Entire communities were forced to leave. Families were separated. Thousands of people were marched hundreds of miles across the empire. Then, New populations from other conquered lands were brought in to replace them. Why? Because people disconnected from their homeland, their traditions, and their neighbors were far less likely to rebel. It was an ancient strategy of forced assimilation. And in 722 BC, that strategy reached Israel. After years of rebellion against Assyria, the northern kingdom finally fell. Its capital, Samaria, was captured. The kingdom of Israel ceased to exist. The book of 2 Kings records the event with heartbreaking simplicity. The people were carried away into exile. The nation that had once been ruled by David and Solomon was shattered. But the story didn't end there. Because after removing much of Israel's population, the Assyrians did something even more significant. They brought in new settlers, people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, Sepharvaim. These foreign groups were relocated into the cities of Samaria. Imagine what happened next. The Israelites who remained now lived beside families from distant cultures, different languages, different customs, different traditions. Over time, they married. Their communities blended, their cultures mixed, and eventually, their religious practices began to mix as well. The Bible even describes a remarkable incident. According to 2 Kings 17, after these foreign settlers arrived, lions began attacking the population. The Assyrian king was told that the people didn't know how to worship the God of the land. So he ordered that one of the Israelite priests who had been taken into exile should return and teach them. Think about how unusual that is. An Israelite priest teaching foreign settlers how to worship the God of Israel. The result was a unique religious community. The people learned about Yahweh, but they also continued honoring many of their ancestral gods. The author of Kings summarizes the situation with one memorable sentence. They feared the Lord, but also served their own gods. For the writers of the Old Testament, this explained why the northern kingdom had fallen. From Judah's perspective, Samaria had become spiritually compromised, neither completely pagan nor completely faithful. But here's where history becomes even more fascinating. Centuries later, the people we call Samaritans strongly rejected that description. They insisted they were the true guardians of Moses' faith. They denied worshiping foreign gods. They claimed their ancestors had preserved the authentic worship of the God of Israel while Jerusalem had gone astray. In other words, the Jews and the Samaritans told completely different stories about the same history. To the Jews, the Samaritans were descendants of a mixed population created by the Assyrians. To the Samaritans, they were the faithful remnant of the northern tribes of Israel. Both groups appealed to Scripture. Both claimed Abraham as their ancestor. Both honored Moses. Both believed they worshipped the one true God. So, who was right? That debate would continue for centuries. But one thing is certain. After the Assyrian conquest, the relationship between North and South would never be the same again. The old political division had become something much deeper. It was now about identity, about ancestry, about worship, about who truly represented the people of God. And that disagreement centered on one place more than any other. Not Jerusalem, but a mountain the Samaritans believed God himself had chosen from the very beginning. A mountain called Mount Gerizim. By the time the Assyrian Empire disappeared, the people living in Samaria had developed a very different understanding of Israel's history. They didn't see themselves as outsiders. They didn't believe they had abandoned the faith of Moses. Quite the opposite. They believed they were the true Israel. And if they were the true Israel, then one enormous question remained. Where was the true place to worship God? For every Jew, the answer was obvious. Jerusalem, the temple built by Solomon. The place where sacrifices had been offered for centuries, the city chosen by God. But the Samaritans completely disagreed. They believed the Jews had chosen the wrong mountain. According to Samaritan tradition, God's chosen place had never been Jerusalem. It had always been Mount Gerizim. That mountain stands just outside the ancient city of Shechem, one of the oldest cities mentioned in the Bible, long before Jerusalem became Israel's capital. Shechem had already witnessed some of the Bible's most important moments. Abraham built an altar there after entering the Promised Land. Jacob purchased land nearby and dug the famous well that still bears his name today. Joshua gathered the tribes at Shechem to renew their covenant with God before his death. Even the blessings and curses described in Deuteronomy were proclaimed from the neighboring mountains of Gerizim and Ebal to the Samaritans. These weren't random events. They were evidence that God had chosen Mount Gerizim from the very beginning. In fact, their version of the Torah contains a remarkable difference. The Samaritans accepted only the first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They rejected the later prophets and historical books accepted by the Jews. Even more fascinating, their copy of the Torah contains textual variations. One of the most significant points emphasizes Mount Gerizim as the place God had chosen for worship. Whether that reading reflects an ancient tradition or a later alteration is still debated by scholars. But for the Samaritans, there was no debate at all. Jerusalem was the innovation. Gerizim was the original. Imagine how explosive that claim sounded to a Jew. The temple in Jerusalem wasn't simply a building. It represented God's covenant with Israel. King David, Solomon, the priesthood, the sacrifices, the festivals. To reject Jerusalem was to reject the very center of Jewish identity. Yet that's exactly what the Samaritans believed. At some point, likely during the Persian period, they constructed their own temple on Mount Gerizim. From then on, there were 2 rival temples, 2 priesthoods, 2 religious centers, both claiming to represent the true worship of the God of Israel. The division was no longer political. It had become deeply theological. Imagine 2 brothers who inherit the same family business. Each insists that the other has forged the will. Each claims to possess the authentic documents. Each believes the other has betrayed the family's legacy. Now imagine that dispute lasting not for years, but for centuries. That's what happened between Jews and Samaritans. Every pilgrimage, every sacrifice, every religious festival reminded them that the other side existed. The conflict became part of everyday life. Children grew up hearing stories about why the other community could not be trusted. Religious identity became inseparable from historical memory. And the hostility only intensified, because eventually, the disagreement stopped being limited to ideas. It turned violent. Temples were attacked. Communities were humiliated. Old wounds became permanent scars. By the time Jesus was born, the conflict had been burning for almost 700 years. Most Jews no longer saw Samaritans as distant relatives. They saw them as religious imposters, people who had corrupted the worship of God, people whose very presence could make someone ceremonially unclean. It's no wonder that when Jesus later asked a Samaritan woman for a drink, she responded with genuine surprise. "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" John immediately explains why. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Those few words summarize centuries of history, but even that brief sentence doesn't reveal just how bitter the relationship had become. Because before Jesus ever spoke to that woman at Jacob's well, there had already been acts of revenge, political humiliation, and even the destruction of a sacred temple. And those events transformed an old disagreement into one of the deepest hatreds in the ancient world. By the 1st century, the hostility between Jews and Samaritans wasn't simply a theological disagreement. It had become personal, deeply personal. Entire generations had grown up hearing stories about why the other side could never be trusted. Children inherited prejudices long before they understood their origins, and every generation added another chapter to the conflict. One of the biggest turning points came after the Jewish people returned from the Babylonian exile. Jerusalem lay in ruins. Its walls had been destroyed. The temple had been burned. Everything had to be rebuilt. As the books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe, groups from the surrounding regions approached the returning exiles with an unexpected proposal. They offered to help rebuild the temple. At first, that sounds like a generous gesture. Wouldn't rebuilding God's house together be a symbol of unity? But the Jewish leaders refused. Completely. They answered, "You have no part with us in building a house to our God." To the returning Jews, preserving the purity of Israel's worship was essential. They believed the people of Samaria had compromised the covenant generations earlier. Allowing them to participate in rebuilding the temple would only repeat the mistakes of the past. But imagine how that rejection felt from the Samaritan perspective. They also believed they worshipped the God of Israel. They also traced their history back to the patriarchs. To them, they weren't outsiders. They were family. Rejected family. That refusal deepened a wound that would last for centuries. The relationship quickly deteriorated. Political opposition followed. Accusations were made to the Persian authorities. Construction projects were delayed. Suspicion turned into open hostility. Then, about 200 years before the birth of Jesus, the conflict exploded. During the Hasmonean period, the Jewish ruler John Hyrcanus marched north with his army. He conquered Samaritan territory. And then, he destroyed the Samaritan Temple on Mount Gerizim. Think about what that meant. For nearly 2 centuries, the Samaritans had worshipped there. It was their holiest place, their spiritual center, the place they believed God Himself had chosen. Now, it was gone, destroyed by fellow descendants of Israel. Imagine if someone demolished the most sacred place in your faith simply because they believed your worship was illegitimate. That memory didn't disappear. It became part of Samaritan identity. From that moment forward, the hatred flowed both directions. Jews viewed Samaritans as heretics. Samaritans viewed Jews as oppressors. The divide became so severe that ordinary travel was affected. If a Jewish traveler needed to go from Judea in the south to Galilee in the north, the shortest route passed directly through Samaria. It would have taken only a few days, but many Jews deliberately avoided it. Instead, they crossed the Jordan River, traveled north on the eastern side, and crossed back into Galilee. The journey became longer, harder, more expensive, but to many it was preferable to walking through Samaritan villages. That's how deeply prejudice had taken root. The hostility even reached the temple itself. Ancient historical sources record that, on at least one occasion, Samaritans secretly scattered human bones throughout the Jerusalem temple during Passover. Under Jewish law, contact with human remains caused ritual impurity. The act wasn't random vandalism. It was a calculated insult, an attempt to desecrate Judaism's holiest place during one of its most sacred festivals. The resentment had become mutual, religious, political, cultural, national. By the time Jesus was born, centuries of distrust shaped almost every interaction between the two communities. Then something extraordinary happened. Jesus entered the scene. Everyone expected a Jewish rabbi to continue the pattern, avoid Samaritans, ignore Samaritans, certainly never praise them. Instead, Jesus did something that stunned both sides. He intentionally walked through Samaria. He sat beside Jacob's well. He asked a Samaritan woman for a drink. He healed Samaritans. And then, he told a story that must have left his audience speechless. Because in that story, the hero wasn't a priest. It wasn't a Levite. It wasn't even an ordinary Jew. The hero was a Samaritan. To modern readers, it's simply the parable of the Good Samaritan. But to the people listening that day, those words almost sounded like a contradiction. A Good Samaritan? For many in Jesus' audience, that phrase would have seemed nearly impossible. And that's exactly why Jesus chose it. By the time Jesus began his ministry, everyone knew the rules. A Jewish rabbi did not associate with Samaritans. You didn't eat with them. You didn't stay in their villages. You certainly didn't ask them for help. Centuries of history had built invisible walls between the two peoples. Most accepted those walls without question. Jesus didn't. Again and again, he deliberately crossed them. Perhaps the most remarkable example is found in John's Gospel. Jesus is traveling from Judea back to Galilee. Many Jewish teachers would have crossed the Jordan River to avoid Samaritan territory altogether. Instead, John tells us something fascinating. He had to pass through Samaria. At first, that sentence seems ordinary. Geographically, Samaria lay between Judea and Galilee. But the Greek wording suggests something deeper. It wasn't merely the shortest route. There was a divine purpose. Jesus wasn't forced there by geography, he was led there by mission. Eventually, he arrived at Jacob's well, one of the oldest and most meaningful places in all of Israel's history. The well had been associated with Jacob himself for generations. It represented a shared ancestry. Both Jews and Samaritans claimed Jacob as their forefather. Yet despite sharing the same ancestor, they could barely speak to one another. Around noon, a Samaritan woman came to draw water. Jesus looked at her and said something astonishing. "Will you give me a drink?" John immediately explains why this was so surprising. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. The woman herself couldn't believe it. She answered, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" Notice that she mentions two barriers. She is a Samaritan. She is also a woman. In that culture, both made the conversation unexpected, but Jesus ignored every social expectation. Instead of debating politics, he offered living water. Instead of reopening centuries of arguments, he offered eternal life. Then, the conversation reached the very issue that had divided Jews and Samaritans for hundreds of years. The woman asked, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." There it was, Mount Gerizim, Jerusalem, the same argument that had separated both peoples for centuries. Everyone expected Jesus to take a side. Instead, he gave an answer no one expected. "A time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." Imagine hearing those words. For hundreds of years, both groups had argued over the correct mountain. Jesus didn't choose one. He pointed beyond both. He declared that true worship wasn't ultimately about geography. It was about worshiping the Father in spirit and in truth. For the first time, today only around 900 Samaritans remain. They are one of the world's smallest religious communities. Most live in two places. One community lives in Kiryat Luza, on the slopes of Mount Gerizim, near the modern city of Nablus. The other lives in Holon, just south of Tel Aviv. Despite their small numbers, they continue to preserve customs that connect directly to the world of the Bible. They still read the Samaritan Pentateuch. They still write using their ancient Hebrew script. They still celebrate Passover. And every year, they climb Mount Gerizim to offer the Passover sacrifice. Watching that ceremony today feels almost like stepping back into the pages of the Old Testament. White-robed priests, families gathered together, lambs prepared according to ancient tradition, prayers recited in a language preserved for generations. It's one of the closest living connections we have to the biblical world. For the Samaritans, Mount Gerizim has never stopped being God's chosen mountain. That belief has remained unchanged for more than 2,000 years. Whether one agrees with their interpretation or not, their existence reminds us that the people Jesus met in the Gospels were not fictional characters. They were part of a real community, with a real history, real traditions, and a story that continues today. And perhaps that's why understanding the Samaritans transforms the way we read the New Testament. Without this history, the woman at the well becomes little more than a conversation. The Good Samaritan becomes a simple lesson about kindness. The grateful leper becomes just another miracle story. But once you understand the centuries of division, everything changes. Jesus wasn't merely being polite to outsiders. He was confronting one of the deepest prejudices in his society. He challenged assumptions that had been accepted for generations. He refused to let history determine how people should treat one another, again and again. He reminded his followers that God's kingdom isn't built on ethnicity, politics, or centuries-old rivalries. It's built on truth, mercy, faith, and love. That's why the hero of his most famous parable wasn't the obvious choice. It was the person everyone least expected. Not because Jesus wanted to elevate one nation above another, but because he wanted his listeners to confront something much closer to home, their own hearts. The Samaritan wasn't the point. The point was that compassion can appear where prejudice says it cannot. Faith can flourish in places we least expect. And sometimes, The people we are most tempted to dismiss are the very people God uses to teach us His greatest lessons. So the next time you read about the Good Samaritan, or the woman at Jacob's well, or the one grateful leper, remember that these weren't isolated stories. They were all part of a single message, a message that began nearly 700 years before Jesus was born, with the division of a kingdom continued through conquest, exile, rival temples, and centuries of hatred, and finally reached its climax in the ministry of Christ. The walls that history had built, Jesus began tearing down, not with armies, not with politics, but with truth, grace, and compassion. Thank you so much for watching. If this video helped you see the Gospels from a completely new perspective, consider giving it a like and subscribing to Bible Decoded. Every week we uncover the history, archaeology, and forgotten context behind the Bible to help you understand Scripture more deeply. And before you go, let us know in the comments, which biblical group or historical mystery would you like us to explore next? Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep decoding the Bible.